I welcome you all here today for our service. And I also want to welcome Bruce Harlan, who's been with us many times before and will be speaking again today for us. So thank you, Bruce, for the wisdom you bring to us each time that you join us for service. So thank you for that. And thanks to everybody here today for the wisdom each of you bring with you. A reminder again that we continue to offer our financial gifts to sustain the church and its work. And you can donate electronically by visiting the church website, or you can send mail checks directly to the church, and you can contribute to Share the Plate. We continue to support our Share the Plate recipients. And this month, that's the Meadville Soup Kitchen. So I was thinking about opening words. Jody asked me for what the opening words should be today, and I just didn't know what I wanted to say. And then someone shared with me a poem that was read at the inauguration. No, it's not Amanda Gorman's poem because I haven't got a copy of that yet. I'd like to have a copy of it. But there's a poem read by Lin-Manuel Miranda, The Cure of Troy, by Seamus Haney. And it seems appropriate. I mean, it certainly was a good choice for the inauguration, but it seems appropriate again for our service. So I want to share that with you this morning. The Cure of Troy. Human beings suffer. They torture one another. They get hurt and they get hard. No poem or play or song can fully right a wrong, inflicted and endured. The innocent and gals beat on their bars together. A hunger striker's father stands in the graveyard dumb. The police widow in veils faints at the funeral home. History says, don't hope, side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that a further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells. Call miracles self-healing, the utter self-revealing, double take of feeling. If there's fire on the mountain or lightning and storm, and a God speaks from the sky, that means someone is hearing the outcry and the birth cry of new life at its term. It means once in a lifetime that justice can rise up and hope and history rhyme. So please join me now in lighting a chalice. I'll recite the words here. You're welcome to recite those yourselves. If you have a candle or chalice you'd like to light, please do so. May the light we now kindle inspire us to use our powers to heal and not to harm, to help and not to hinder, to bless and not curse, to serve you, Spirit of life. Again, please join me in affirming our covenant and mission. Our covenant is to be a loving, joyful community that nurtures spiritual growth, promotes compassion, social responsibility, and service in an atmosphere of mutual trust. Our mission is to be a faith community devoted to love and respect, reason, and justice. And our hymn of the month is I Am That Great and Fiery Force. Feel free to sing along at home. I think it works better if we keep our mics on mute because of the it's hard to synchronize, but And thanks to the Sunny Hill UU Church of South Hills, Pittsburgh, for creating and sharing this video with us. So.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to speak to all of you. Just be mindful that after I give my little talk, there'll be an opportunity to have a breakout session where we can talk about how we can, what we can do to improve and lift up the lives of our community, our families, our nation, etc. So, in thinking about today's talk, I think it was serendipitous that the theme was imagination, because I had been struggling to find some words that I could use with my staff here at Women's Services that would continue to motivate them through this very difficult time. And when I started doing some research on imagination, I was pleased, really tickled, to come across this concept of strategic imagination. And so I put together a talk that I plan to use with my staff, and I'm going to share it at Rotary, and I'm going to share it with my board as well. And so it begins with a little story about a transatlantic jet, which enters a large storm system where it was buffeted by strong winds. And during the most intense turbulence, the passengers were startled to hear a loud crash in the cockpit. And then several minutes later, the captain's voice was heard over the PA system, and he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have sustained some damage as a result of the storm. Fortunately, I have good news to go along with the bad news. The bad news is that our plane's navigational system is ruined and we don't know where we're going. But the good news is we have a strong tailwind and we're making record time." So I think this story captures perfectly where we are as a country, as a community, even as a church. For the last year, we have found ourselves tossed about in a sea of turbulent change. Almost all of us are struggling just to keep our heads above water. You know, and as the organizations and the businesses and the churches that we frequent and that we belong to, we and our leaders have very little energy left to think about where the currents are carrying us. Moreover, merely treading water is no way to navigate. You get nowhere, you soon grow exhausted, and you end up drowning anyway. So regardless of how treacherous life and the times are, none of us, including our leaders, can afford to overlook two key considerations, right? Where do we want to go, and how are we going to get there? In times of crisis, like the current pandemic that we're all facing, our initial impulse is to react and defend. And then after a period of time, we kind of dig in and we construct plans to manage the challenges that follow. And as the storm abates, and I think that's where we are now, we begin to rebound and make adjustments in order to exploit and manage the new normal. It is precisely at this moment that we are in a position to reinvent ourselves, especially our communities, our businesses, our schools and churches. We do this by grabbing a hold of adversity and treating it as an opportunity to make meaningful changes. Right now is the time that we need imagination more than ever, and not just ordinary, everyday imagination, but strategic imagination. So what is this thing called strategic imagination? Well, it means challenging deep-rooted assumptions and rejecting the tendency to assess new opportunities by our current systems and standards. All too often, we retreat into thinking that tomorrow must be and will be like yesterday. Yes, strategic imagination is tremendously difficult because it requires us to put aside yesterday's tired assumptions and orthodoxies and begin to actively rethink from scratch the way value can be, should be, must be, and will be created. Lewis Martins, who's director of the Herb Kelleher Center for Entrepreneurship at the University of Texas School of Business, argued in a paper published in Advances in Strategic Management that the key to revolutionary business strategy lies in the strategist's ability to use a future-focused kind of imagination. So in the business world, think about Apple and Starbucks, Amazon, Netflix, Airbnb, Uber, and Whole Foods. These kind of breakout success stories show what is possible when business leaders imagine into the future rather than reenacting the past. For example, if Whole Foods were merely a replication of the past, it would just be another small health food store. Instead, it required a completely different imagining of the future to combine an organic farmer's market with a big grocery store format. That's the kind of thing that changes the mold within any given industry and comes up with a whole new space. For example, you don't get a Cirque du Soleil by just trying to make another circus, says Martins. Now, the naysayers will argue that thinking differently about strategy is impossible, but strategy isn't written in stone. After all, what was strategic yesterday is frivolous and inconsequential today. So what if we were to start from scratch, to see in Technicolor what a better world would look like, a world not constrained by today's stifling disunity and inequities? What if we imagined and then believed in a vastly different, radically better future? Well, it just so happens that Martin Luther King Jr. did imagine a different kind of future, and he called it the beloved community. And I know you're all familiar with this. Dr. King's beloved community is a global vision in which all people can share in the wealth of the earth. In the beloved community, poverty, hunger, and homelessness will not be tolerated because international standards of human decency will just not allow it. Racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice will be replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood. To bring about Dr. King's beloved community would take a leap of faith, wouldn't it? But who better to lead others in this kind of thinking and imagining than the faith community, who, after all, is accustomed to taking leaps of faith? Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in his letter from Birmingham jail in response to criticism of the nonviolent protests in Birmingham back in 1863. And in that letter, King responds specifically to a statement published in a local newspaper by 8 white clergymen, calling the protest unwise and untimely. King criticized the leadership of the white church for championing the status quo. He expected more of the church, an institution that once transformed the mores of society, but laments the fact that the contemporary church has fallen far from its early Christian origins to become an irrelevant social club rather than a source of inspiration. And in that letter, he wrote, quote, "I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And then my favorite line, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly," unquote. Now, who among us was not moved by the events that unfolded on January 6th at our nation's capital? We're all so interrelated, and all of us were traumatized by the events that unfolded on that day. And who hasn't been to the local grocery store and found themselves annoyed and getting angry with those who were not and chose not to wear a mask? You know, regardless of one's political leanings, wearing a mask is really just a simple expression of love and respect for each other. It's how we practice being a good neighbor. Why? because whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. All of us, of course, are anxious that this current crisis will soon be over. There is a great sense of hope and optimism that these new vaccines will get us back to how things used to be. But we may not be able to return to our familiar pre-crisis reality. Pandemics and other social crises often demand new attitudes, needs, and behaviors, which we need to anticipate. Imagination, that capacity to create, evolve, and exploit new models of things or situations that don't yet exist, this is the crucial factor in seizing and creating new opportunities. Based on their research for a new book on the imaginative corporation, Martin Reeves and Jack Fuller have discerned 7 imperatives, and these 7 imperatives can easily be adapted to a faith community, more specifically to a church, particularly like the UU Church here in Meadville. These 7 imperatives are: 1, carve out time for reflection. Well, we're going to do a little of that today, right? Crises place heavy demands on leaders and managers, and it's easy to lose the already slim time we might have for reflection, but we won't see the big picture, let alone a shapeable picture of the future, unless we stand back and reflect. Number 2, we have to be willing to ask open, active questions. In a crisis, we likely won't have immediate answers, and we therefore need to employ good questions. If we ask better questions, we'll get better answers. So rather than ask what will happen to us, what if we asked how can we create new options? 3, we need to allow ourselves to be playful. In unprecedented, rapidly changing situations, play is a critical capability. We can make interesting new connections between ideas when we allow ourselves to loosen up from our regular goal-driven, laser-focused, instrumental approach. 4, let us set up a system for sharing ideas. Someone somewhere in this church is likely being forced by circumstances to experiment with new ways of doing things. All of you have had to adapt to a new way of getting together and worshiping. The imaginative church picks up, codifies, and scales these innovations. Imagination doesn't just happen on an individual level. Ideas evolve and spread by being able to skip between minds. Churches need to facilitate collective imagination. The key to this is allowing new ideas to be shared while they are still in development, creating forums for people to communicate in a casual way without hierarchy, reports, permissions, or financial justifications. 5, seek out the unexpected. Imagination is triggered by surprising inputs. Our pattern-seeking minds adapt our mental models when we see something that does not fit. And when we adapt our mental models, we entertain different strategies and new courses of action. 6, encourage experimentation. Although a crisis stretches our resources, it is important to encourage experiments, even if only on a shoestring budget. Natural systems are most resilient when they are diverse, and that diversity comes from trying new ways of doing things. Our ideas only become useful if they are tested in the real world, often generating unexpected outcomes and stimulating further thinking and new ideas. And lastly, we must stay hopeful. Imagination feeds off the aspirations and aggravations that propel us to seek a better reality. When we lose hope and adopt a passive mindset, we cease to believe that we can meet our ideals or fix our problems. As members of this church, ask yourself whether you are giving other members grounds for hope, imagination, and innovation, or whether you are using pessimistic or fatalistic language, which could create a downward spiral in the church's capabilities of being creative. Dealing with real risk involves taking imaginative risk, which requires hope. Never in our lifetimes has the power of imagination been more important in defining our immediate future. So says Jim Laurie, CEO of Stanley Black & Decker. And he says leaders need to seize the opportunity to inspire and harness the imagination of their organizations during this challenging time. So true for the church. So let me close with one of my favorite stories. It's the story of a grandfather who was sharing with his grandson what it was like for him growing up on a farm. And every summer, the family would set up a produce stand down by the highway that passed by their farm. And everyone in the family was expected to help out. Well, one day when all the family members were occupied with the produce stand, a neighbor came by the house and dropped off some chickens. Well, that night when the family came home, they immediately realized that these chickens had gotten loose and were running free around the yard. And it took the family well over an hour to round them all up. Well, the grandfather said his father was so incensed that the very next morning he marched over to the neighbor's house and he said, "Paul, what were you thinking when you left those chickens on our porch? Don't you know that it took us over an hour to round them all up? And when we were finished, we could only find 12. At which point Paul cut his father off and said, "Now, John, you need to stop right there. You should know that I only dropped off 6 chickens." And I love that story because it showcases what it is we can accomplish when we don't place limitations on our expectations, right? All crises contain the seeds of opportunity. Many businesses, communities, families, and churches who are struggling now will likely find a second life during and after the crisis if they can keep alive and harness their imaginations. Imagination may seem like a frivolous luxury in a crisis, but it actually is a necessity for building future success. So before we go into a breakout session, I just want to add a few comments to preface the conversation. So all of us in attendance today have been given the gift of time, right? Sufficient time throughout our lives to accomplish our wildest dreams and perhaps our most immediate needs. But this gift is also a curse because we tend to think we have plenty of time to get around to those things which we know are important but hard to accomplish. And so as we ask ourselves, what can we do today, tomorrow, next week to improve the life of our community, our families, our church, try to think of it from the perspective of having very little time left. For example, suppose you were told you had 1 month left to live. And suppose you used most of that time to take care of personal matters and then took time to get to those things on your bucket list. But after all of that, you only had 1 day left. What would you do with that 1 day to improve the life of your family and your community? Or think about it this way. I was doing a little research on the Unitarian Universalist church, and I discovered that Unitarian Universalist congregations affirm and promote 7 principles, which you all hold as strong values and moral guides. And that first principle affirms the inherent worth and dignity of every person. The second promotes justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. I love that. Now imagine you were told that your church will close in 1 month. There was nothing you could do to alter this outcome. So what would the church do as their final swan song? As church members, now you were no longer shackled with the burdens of maintaining a building, paying the bills, looking for speakers, etc. The possibilities are endless, are they not? What would you do? This comes from Amanda Gorman's poem that she read at the inauguration. She said, "We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover. In every known nook of our nation and every corner called our country, our people diverse and beautiful will emerge battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade of flame and unafraid. For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it." So thank you all for tuning into my little homily. Hope you have a great week and a great new year. Thank you all.
Thank you, Bruce. And I'd actually like to start joys and concerns by just offering the joy of having Bruce with us again to speak. I found his homily today really insightful and really helpful. And so thank you. It's always a great pleasure to have you here with us. Another joy that was shared, the joy of the inauguration this week, which I think no matter what your political leanings, coming to a place of settling, I think has been good. Just a little bit of calm after what's been a really challenging time. And so a concern, praying for the healing and health of our country and world. And gratitude to all who work toward that goal. So we'll take a moment now to reflect on the joys and sorrows heard, and also, and it may perhaps especially as those that we hold unspoken in our hearts because they're too tender to share. I'd like to share a final joy in having this community where we can hold one another in love and healing and wholeness. And thank you all for being here with me today. So I'll take this moment to extinguish our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we meet again.